October 23, 1944. A Philippine dawn broke over the Sibuyan Sea. Mist clung to the water like a shroud. There was no sound, save for the faint creak of steel, the gentle slap of waves against hulls, and somewhere in the distance, a gull crying over war it could not understand. Beneath those still waters lay one of the largest gatherings of warships ever assembled in human history. Above them, the hopes of a nation teetered on the edge of oblivion. Japan had reached a crossroads. By late 1944, their empire was bleeding. Losses at Saipan and Guam had placed the Japanese home islands within reach of American bombers. Oil shortages crippled their fleet. Pilots were exhausted, their aircraft worn thin by constant battle. Yet their leaders clung to hope. Perhaps not hope, but desperation disguised as strategy. They called it Shogo, Operation Victory. Victory. The word carried both irony and tragedy. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the last gamble. Leyte Gulf was their stage, their final scene. But what they had planned was not a battle. It was an ambush, a trap meant to cripple America's Seventh Fleet before it could secure the Philippines. If Leyte could be won, Japan might stall the American advance, perhaps even reverse it. At the very least, they would force America to pay a high price. The reality was darker. Japan's fleet was no longer the pride of the Pacific. It was a collection of battered survivors, running on dwindling fuel and patched metal. Their carriers had fewer than 100 planes between them. Their battleships, including the legendary Yamato and Musashi, were titans with armor thicker than most skyscraper walls, but no shield against the air power of the modern era. Three forces converged on Leyte Gulf. Admiral Kurita's center force would move through the Sibuyan Sea, carrying the bulk of Japan's last battleships and cruisers. Admiral Nishimura's southern force would attack through Surigao Strait. Admiral Ozawa's northern force, the carriers, would sail as a decoy, drawing American carriers away from the main clash. Here is where irony took its place in history. Japan's carriers, once symbols of naval supremacy, were now bait. Without enough planes to mount a real strike, their value was to lure the enemy into the trap, like soldiers sending forward the wounded to shield the strong. The numbers tell the story plainly. Kurita's center force carried 10 battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, including Yamato and Musashi. American intelligence estimated nearly 20 capital ships in all. They did not yet know that the Japanese fleet was a shadow of its former self. Japanese planners hoped their strike would surprise the Americans, but surprise is fragile at sea. The Americans had cracked Japanese codes. They knew the general plan. They knew when the ambush would come. What they could not predict was exactly how desperate and bold the Japanese commanders would be. Kurita's fleet steamed in formation through the Sibuyan Sea on the morning of October 24th. The sea was glassy, the sun barely up, the horizon glowing pale gold. On Yamato's bridge, Admiral Kurita surveyed his fleet with mixture of resolve and unease. These ships were the pride of the Imperial Navy, floating cathedrals of steel and firepower. The largest battleship ever built, Yamato carried 9 18-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing over 3,000 pounds across 24 miles. Musashi, her sister ship, was no less formidable. Yet neither could survive the storm that was about to fall from the sky. For in this new age of warfare, air power had eclipsed armor. The first wave came from the east. From American carriers hundreds of miles away, planes were launched in an unrelenting tide. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, and scout planes, hundreds of them, descended in waves upon the Japanese formation. From above, the scene must have looked like a swarm of angry hornets. The carriers' decks were alive with motion, engines screaming, pilots straining to see their targets. For Kurita, the attack was the moment all his preparation led to. For the men in the water below, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Musashi was the first to be struck. 17 bomb hits, 19 torpedoes. The ship shuddered under the assault, her enormous steel plates groaning under the punishment. Flames tore through her decks. Smoke billowed in black clouds that blotted out the sun. Below deck, sailors scrambled through corridors flooded with oil and seawater. Some tried to fight the fires. Others scrambled to abandon ship. A voice recorded later from a survivor said, "The sea turned black with oil, and the ship groaned like some dying beast. We clung to wreckage as if our lives depended on it, because they did." Musashi sank by late afternoon, the largest ship in naval history swallowed whole by the ocean. Yamato fought on. Her gunners returned fire with discipline, but the attackers were relentless. Over the course of hours, planes kept coming, climbing to the haze of smoke to deliver their ordnance. At one point, an American pilot later wrote, "It was like swatting a fly with a sledgehammer, but the fly refused to die." There was an odd sort of truth in that. Japan's battleships were powerful but vulnerable. Pride without protection was a kind of doom. For the Japanese commanders, the loss of Musashi was a blow, but they pressed forward. The fate of the Philippines, and perhaps the empire itself, rested on this clash. They still believed in Shogo. Even as the fleet took damage, Admiral Kurita ordered his ships onward. "We will fight for the honor of the emperor," he told his staff. "We must give our all." Yet the reality was not honor, it was attrition. The Japanese fleet was burning through its strength with every passing hour. Meanwhile, in the American command rooms, there was a sense of quiet confidence. Admiral Halsey knew the stakes, but he also knew the odds. His carrier groups, with hundreds of planes and near-perfect intelligence, had the advantage. "They came to us because they had no choice," he later said. "We were the net and they were the fish." It was not cruelty so much as inevitability. In war, the hunter does not lament the fate of its prey. By midday, Kurita's center force had been reduced in strength. Ships limped forward under tow. Some were damaged so badly they could no longer fight. Still, Kurita pressed on. His orders were clear: reach Leyte Gulf, strike the American landing forces, and force a decisive battle. For Japan, this was not a battle among many. It was the battle. Leyte was the last chance to reverse years of defeat. For the Americans, it was a warning. The war was not yet won, and the price of victory would be paid in blood. Irony, of course, was not lost on either side. Japan's victory operation had become a desperate gamble, carried out by ships that were more relic than weapon. Their carriers had become decoys. Their battleships, mighty as they were, faced an enemy armed with hundreds of aircraft guided by radar and code breaking. And yet, there they were, steaming forward into the teeth of an impossible storm, proud and doomed all at once. As evening fell, the surviving ships of Kurita's force regrouped. Smoke still curled from damaged hulls. Men moved silently on deck, their faces grim. Somewhere in the shadows, a sailor joked quietly to his companion, "At least we won't have to polish the brass for the next battle." It was dark humor, the kind born of men who know the odds and still march forward. By the close of Section 1, Leyte Gulf was poised on the brink of history. The Japanese ambush was underway, but it was no longer a secret to either side. For Japan, this was a final gamble. For America, it was a challenge they were prepared to meet head-on. And somewhere in between, the men of both fleets steeled themselves for what was to come. The battle had begun, but what came next shocked them even more. As night fell over Leyte Gulf, the battle had already begun to carve its story into history. October 24th to 25th, 1944, would come to be remembered as the largest naval battle ever fought, a clash not just of steel and firepower, but of desperation, pride, and human endurance. Surigao Strait, a narrow channel between Leyte and Mindanao, was about to become a graveyard for ships and for dreams. Admiral Nishimura's southern force slipped into the strait under the cloak of night. 2 battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers, moved forward in formation. Their orders were simple: charge through, strike the landing forces at Leyte, and break the American line. It was a mission as dangerous as it was bold. On paper, this was a last act of valor. In reality, it was a plunge into an ambush waiting patiently in the darkness. Waiting for them was Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's fleet. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, 39 PT boats. This was not a meeting of equals. It was a slaughterhouse with its doors already open. The Americans had anticipated the Japanese approach. Radar-guided positioning allowed them to arrange their forces in a textbook crossing the T maneuver, a naval tactic dreamed of in classrooms, but rarely executed in real battle. Oldendorf had prepared for Nishimura's advance, as though waiting for a prize to be led into a trap, and Nishimura, unaware of the full scale of American readiness, sailed willingly toward it. At the edge of the strait, American PT boats moved first, launching torpedoes into the night. The Japanese ships replied with gunfire, cutting through the darkness. It was a grim exchange, but a prelude. Destroyers raced forward, launching salvo after salvo of torpedoes. Somewhere amid the chaos, sailors on Yamashiro wrote later the strange beauty of battle. The sea was lit in flashes, like fireworks for a funeral. The first contact with Oldendorf's main line was devastating. Fuso and Yamashiro were struck again and again. The enemy was not just waiting. It was prepared with firepower that no ship could withstand. Yamashiro fought fiercely, her great guns thundering across the water. Fuso steamed on, seemingly unstoppable, until a final barrage broke her in half. She burned, sank, and took with her more than 1,000 lives. Survivors described the water as black with oil and fire, and filled with the cries of men in the dark. Numbers make the horror clearer. Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait with over 10,000 men. By morning, almost the entire fleet had been destroyed. Japanese losses in that single night were catastrophic. Thousands dead, ships gone. American casualties were shockingly low. 39 men killed, a testament to preparation and overwhelming superiority. Oldendorf later remarked with understated irony, "We brought more firepower than they bargained for." It was not a battle, it was an execution. For Nishimura, the night was the last act. His force had been broken, but still he pressed toward Leyte with what remained. Somewhere in the dark, sailors whispered that they were fighting not for victory, but for survival. But survival was slipping through their fingers. Leyte Gulf was no longer a place where they could decide the war's fate. It was becoming a tomb. Meanwhile, further north, Admiral Ozawa's carriers drifted toward their fate. Their role as bait was working. American fleets turned toward them, diverting attention from the center force. But the irony was cruel. These carriers, symbols of Japanese naval pride, carried barely a handful of planes. Their strike groups were shadows of their former selves. American air power descended upon them with relentless fury. Planes swarmed, and by the afternoon of October 25th, Ozawa's carriers were burning, their decks shattered, their air wings gone. Japan's last hope of using its carriers as a decisive force was extinguished. The climax of Leyte Gulf would come not in Surigao Strait, nor among the northern carriers, but at Samar. Here, a small group of escort carriers and destroyers, known later as Taffy 3, found themselves face-to-face with Kurita's battered but still formidable center force. What followed was a clash as improbable as it was heroic. Against overwhelming odds, these small ships charged. Destroyers braved the guns of battleships, launching torpedoes in close quarters. Carriers scrambled planes armed with whatever weapons they had. Smoke, fire, and noise filled the morning air. Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston later wrote, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." His words became prophecy. Johnson herself was hit repeatedly, burning and sinking, but her crew fought to the last man. Others joined the charge. Destroyers came at Kurita's mighty ships like charging knights, drawing fire, buying time for the carriers to escape. The scene was chaos given meaning by courage. The battle at Samar was more than a clash of steel. It was a test of human resolve. Men who knew they could not survive still threw themselves forward. They fought not for glory, but for the survival of comrades, for their country, and perhaps for the last shreds of honor. Japanese gunners fired relentlessly, but the ferocity of the American defense was something they had not expected. Kurita's force, despite its size, began to falter. Confusion reigned, and in that chaos lay the seed of his retreat. By the end of October 25th, the largest naval battle in history had reached its conclusion. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 10,000 men were dead, their ships sunk to the bottom of the sea. America had lost a handful of escort carriers and destroyers and a few hundred lives. The cost was heavy, but the scale of Japanese losses was staggering. Leyte Gulf was not just a battle. It was the death knell of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Kurita withdrew under the cover of smoke, convinced he faced a larger enemy than he could defeat. For the Japanese Navy, the tide of war had turned irreversibly. Leyte Gulf was meant to be their last chance. Instead, it became a graveyard for hope. Admiral Ozawa's voice over the radio that night reflected the bitter truth. The operation has failed. The enemy controls the sea. The way ahead is closed. For the Americans, Leyte Gulf was a confirmation of a hard truth. Control of the Pacific would be won not in a single great battle, but in a series of attritional victories. It was a lesson written in steel and fire, in the courage of men who charged into hopeless odds, and in the destruction of ships that had once been the pride of a nation. The irony of Leyte Gulf was unmistakable. Japan's victory operation had become a funeral for the Imperial Navy. Its largest battleships, its last carriers, its finest crews, all gone. And yet, the Americans lost not because they underestimated the enemy, but because they had underestimated their own capacity for resolve. They had stood at the edge of disaster and, against the odds, refused to fall. When the seas calmed, the war's tides were set forever. The Pacific would belong to the Allies. Japan's empire was already sinking, long before surrender was signed. The ambush that was supposed to turn the tide for Japan had destroyed any chance of doing so. In its place was a stark truth that power without preparation is nothing, and pride without purpose is a path to ruin. Leyte Gulf was more than the largest naval battle in history. It was a final reckoning. It was a moment when the Imperial Navy, once the most feared force on the seas, found itself broken not by a single blow, but by the cumulative weight of years of war, industrial power, intelligence, and courage. And as the sun rose over the still waters where thousands of men had fought and died, it became clear that this battle was not only a turning point in a war. It was the end of an era. The ghosts of Leyte still linger. Ships lie beneath the waves, skeletons of steel. Survivors carry the memory of nights lit by gunfire, of smoke and fire, of men who charged knowing the odds were against them. For historians, it is a study of strategy and sacrifice. For sailors, it is a testament to the courage of those who, in the darkest hour, gave everything. For the world, Leyte Gulf is a story of how the ambition to turn a tide can itself be drowned in the storm it calls forth.